Guadalcanal, January 1943. 14 American soldiers dead in 72 hours. Not from banzai charges, not from artillery, from invisible enemies who killed with single shots from trees no one could identify. The Japanese snipers owned the jungle west of Point Cruz, and every conventional solution had failed. Second Lieutenant John George walked into his battalion commander's tent, carrying something that made every career officer in the room physically recoil. A civilian hunting rifle, a Winchester Model 70 bolt-action sporting rifle with a Lyman Alaskan scope, the kind of weapon you'd order from a catalog to shoot deer in Pennsylvania. Not even military issue. George had purchased it himself with 2 years of National Guard pay before shipping out. Captain Morris looked at the rifle like George had brought a fishing rod to a tank battle. Leave that mail-order sweetheart in your tent, Lieutenant. Carry a real weapon. The other platoon leaders nodded. Everyone knew the future of warfare was semi-automatic. The M1 Garands fired 8 rounds as fast as you could pull the trigger. George's bolt-action Winchester fired 1 shot, then required manual cycling before firing again. Slower, old-fashioned, obsolete. The prevailing doctrine was overwhelming firepower. Volume of fire wins battles. The Army had spent millions developing semi-automatic rifles specifically to replace bolt actions. And here was George, a newly minted lieutenant with dirt still on his bars, suggesting a sporting rifle could solve a problem that had stumped battalion staff. But George had discovered something in those groves that contradicted every training manual, every lecture at Fort Benning, every assumption about modern infantry combat. What happened over the next 4 days wouldn't just save his company. It would spread through the Pacific theater and influence American military doctrine for the next 80 years. Why did a civilian hunting rifle succeed where military weapons failed? And what did George understand about killing that every expert had missed? The Japanese sniper problem on Guadalcanal wasn't new by January 1943. It had been killing Americans since the Marines landed 5 months earlier. But west of Point Cruz, something had changed. The snipers were more patient, better concealed, and deadlier than anything the 132nd Infantry Regiment had encountered. They didn't fire randomly. They studied American patterns. A soldier would cross the same clearing 3 times safely. On the 4th crossing, a single shot. The soldier's body would lie in the open as bait. Anyone who tried to recover him became the next target. Medical corpsmen died reaching for the wounded. Officers died rallying their men. Radio operators died the moment they extended an antenna. Battalion intelligence estimated 5 to 7 enemy snipers operating in a 2-square-mile area of coconut groves and dense jungle. American forces outnumbered them 50 to 1. It didn't matter. The snipers had turned a relatively secure rear area into a killing ground that paralyzed movement. Standard American counter-sniper doctrine called for suppressive fire. When you took sniper fire, you responded with overwhelming volume. Rifle squads would unleash hundreds of rounds into suspected sniper positions. Machine gun crews would rake entire tree lines. Mortars would drop high-explosive shells into the canopy. The theory was simple. Blanket the area with so much firepower that you either kill the sniper or force him to relocate, revealing his position. It wasn't working. The Japanese snipers tied themselves into treetops with rope harnesses. American suppressive fire would chew through palm fronds and coconut trunks, but the snipers stayed silent and invisible. They'd wait hours, sometimes days, then resume killing. Trying to spot them was nearly impossible. The jungle canopy created a 3-dimensional maze of shadows and foliage. A skilled sniper 50 feet up a tree, wrapped in camouflaged cloth, surrounded by palm fronds, was effectively invisible to ground observers. The battalion had tried everything. They sent out night patrols to locate sniper positions. The Japanese heard them coming from 100 yards away. They deployed scout observer teams with binoculars. The teams saw nothing but got shot at. They called in airstrikes to defoliate suspected areas. The Zeros left craters, but the snipers returned. George watched this failure from his platoon position. He'd been in country for 6 weeks, fresh from officer candidate school. Before the war, he'd been a competitive marksman in the National Guard. He'd spent weekends shooting long-range rifle competitions, the kind where a quarter-inch group at 300 yards meant the difference between winning and going home empty-handed. He understood something the Army doctrine writers didn't. Volume of fire and precision were different tools for different problems. And the sniper problem required precision. John George's Winchester Model 70 wasn't a combat weapon by anyone's definition. Winchester marketed it to hunters who wanted the finest commercially available bolt-action rifle. It had a walnut stock, oil finish to a fine sheen. The metalwork was blued steel, polished to a mirror finish. The bolt cycled with the smoothness of a bank vault closing. It was beautiful in the way fine sporting arms are beautiful, crafted for accuracy and aesthetics, not battlefield durability. George had mounted a Lyman Alaskan scope, a civilian optic designed for Western big-game hunting, 4-power magnification, which sounds modest now but was sophisticated for 1943. The Army's standard-issue M1 9903 Springfield sniper rifles used weaker scopes, and most infantry weapons had no magnification at all. George's setup gave him an enormous advantage in target identification, but that advantage came with trade-offs that made his weapon tactically questionable. The Winchester fired 30-06 cartridges from a 5-round internal magazine, the same round as the M1 Garand, but the Garand held 8 rounds and fired semi-automatically. George had to work a bolt between shots. In the time an M1 rifleman fired 8 aimed shots, George could fire perhaps 3. In a firefight, that disparity could be fatal. The rifle was also fragile by military standards. That polished walnut stock would crack under rough handling. The blued finish would rust in Guadalcanal's humidity without constant maintenance. The precise tolerances that made the rifle accurate also made it vulnerable to dirt and sand. Military weapons were deliberately over-engineered to function in abuse conditions. George's Winchester was engineered for accuracy under ideal conditions. His fellow officers mocked it openly. Captain Morris called it a toy. First Lieutenant Dawkins said bringing a sporting rifle to war was like bringing a tennis racket. The prevailing attitude was that George didn't understand real combat. He was a weekend warrior who'd bought an expensive hunting rifle to feel special. When the shooting started, he'd realize firepower mattered more than precision. Even George's own platoon sergeant was skeptical. Staff Sergeant Kowalski had fought in the Philippines campaign. He'd seen what Japanese ambushes looked like. "Sir, when they hit us, you're gonna wish you had 8 rounds of semi-auto instead of that bolt gun," Kowalski told him. It was respectful but firm. George appreciated the honesty. The criticism wasn't baseless. American military doctrine had evolved specifically toward semi-automatic weapons because volume of fire won most engagements. In a typical Pacific Theater firefight, American squads firing M1 Garands could put out sustained accurate fire that Japanese soldiers with bolt-action Arisaka rifles couldn't match. The Americans won those exchanges through superior firepower. George's decision to voluntarily downgrade to a bolt action seemed tactically insane. But George wasn't planning to fight typical engagements. He was planning to fight one specific problem: patient, concealed snipers at extended range. And for that problem, he needed something the M1 Garand couldn't provide: absolute precision. January 22nd, 0700 hours. George positioned himself in the ruins of a Japanese supply building west of Point Cruz. The position gave him a clear sight line across 400 yards of coconut groves where the snipers operated. He brought only his Winchester, 200 rounds of carefully selected ammunition, and a notebook. The ammunition choice mattered more than anyone realized. George had handpicked cartridges based on weight consistency. He'd weighed each bullet on a powder scale, selecting only those within half a grain of each other. Military ammunition was mass-produced with wider tolerances. George's ammunition was match-grade in everything but name. Each cartridge would perform nearly identically. He settled into a prone position behind a collapsed wall. Winchester rested on sandbags he'd positioned the night before. Then he waited. Not with the restless energy of a soldier expecting contact, but with the patient stillness of a hunter who knows his quarry will eventually reveal itself. 2 hours passed, then 3. Most soldiers couldn't maintain that level of motionless vigilance. George had spent hundreds of hours in deer stands in Pennsylvania, waiting for whitetails that might never appear. He understood that stillness was a skill. At 10:15 hours, a rifleman from Baker Company crossed a clearing 300 yards northwest. Single shot. The rifleman dropped. Medics ran toward him. George didn't move. He watched through his scope, scanning the trees in the direction the shot came from. Most soldiers would have started shooting immediately. George waited. The key was understanding bullet trajectory and sound delay. The crack of the rifle report arrived after the bullet. George had heard the shot come from a general direction, but that wasn't precise enough. He needed to see muzzle flash or scope glint or movement, anything that betrayed an exact position. 15 minutes later, the Japanese sniper shifted, just slightly. A palm frond moved in a way wind doesn't move foliage. George locked onto the spot. He could barely make out the shape, just a dark mass in the tree canopy that might have been shadow or might have been human. He ranged the distance using mil-dots in his scope reticle, 340 yards. He adjusted his scope for bullet drop. The 30-06 would drop approximately 31 inches at that range. He accounted for a light crosswind from the east. Then he controlled his breathing the way competitive shooters do. Slow exhale, pause at the bottom of the breath cycle, gentle trigger squeeze. The Winchester cracked. Through the scope, George saw the dark mass lurch, then fall. The body dropped 40 feet through the canopy, hitting branches on the way down. It landed in a clearing George could see clearly. Japanese soldier, Type 97 sniper rifle, camouflage smock, rope harness still attached. News traveled fast. By noon, George's company commander wanted to see the body. By 1400 hours, battalion staff officers were standing over the dead sniper, examining George's shooting position. They measured the distance, 340 yards. Through jungle canopy, first shot kill. Word spread through Japanese sniper teams faster than American officers expected. By January 23rd, the enemy knew someone was hunting them. Their behavior changed immediately. They stopped taking easy shots at exposed soldiers. They fired less frequently. They relocated more often. George had disrupted their operational tempo with a single kill, but they didn't withdraw. Instead, they adapted. George realized he was now in a different kind of engagement. Not infantry combat, but a precision duel between marksmen who understood distance and concealment. The Japanese snipers began watching for him specifically. When George took position in the ruined supply building again on January 23rd, someone shot at his position within 20 minutes. The round struck the wall 18 inches from his head. They'd zeroed his location. George relocated to a different position 100 yards south. He brought camouflage netting he'd improvised from burlap and local vegetation. He learned to move only during American artillery fire when sound would mask his movement. He adopted the sniper's own tactics: patience, concealment, stillness. The kills came slowly. January 24th, one confirmed kill at 410 yards. The Japanese sniper had been concealed in a tall coconut palm, tied high in the crown. George spotted him only because the man shifted position to aim at an American supply column. George's shot struck center mass. The body fell and hung suspended in the rope harness, visible to both sides as a psychological message. January 25th, two more confirmed kills. George had learned to identify sniper positions by studying the geometry of previous attacks. Japanese snipers favored certain types of trees that provided both elevation and concealment. They positioned themselves to cover American movement routes. George began pre-identifying likely positions, then waiting for occupancy. When a sniper climbed into a position George was already watching, the Japanese soldier was dead before he settled his rifle. The battalion's casualty rate west of Point Cruz dropped dramatically. 14 dead in the 72 hours before George started hunting. 2 dead in the 72 hours after. The Japanese snipers hadn't withdrawn, but they'd become defensive. They were hiding from George instead of hunting Americans. Other officers began paying attention. Captain Morris stopped calling the Winchester a toy. First Lieutenant Dawkins asked George detailed questions about his technique. Staff Sergeant Kowalski admitted he'd been wrong about the bolt action. "Sir, I didn't understand what you were doing. This isn't suppressive fire. This is something different." George explained it to anyone who'd listen. The semi-automatic advantage mattered in close-range firefights where volume of fire suppressed the enemy. But sniper duels were different. At 300 to 500 yards, the first shot determined the outcome. Semi-automatic follow-up shots were irrelevant if your first shot missed. The enemy sniper would be relocating before you chambered a second round. What mattered was making that first shot count, and that required absolute accuracy. The Winchester's bolt-action design served that accuracy in ways semi-automatic rifles couldn't match. The bolt locked into the receiver with enormous rigidity, creating a stable platform. The trigger broke cleanly at 3 pounds with no creep. The barrel was free-floated, untouched by the stock, so it vibrated consistently. Every mechanical element was optimized for precision. By February 1st, George's confirmed kill count reached 11 Japanese snipers. But the numbers didn't tell the full story. The psychological impact was enormous. Japanese sniper teams west of Point Cruz had effectively abandoned their positions. American casualties from sniper fire dropped to near zero. An entire tactical problem had been solved by one lieutenant with a civilian rifle. Battalion intelligence noticed something unexpected. Japanese radio intercepts mentioned the American hunter and warned sniper teams to avoid the Point Cruz sector. The enemy had identified George as a specific threat and changed their deployment patterns to avoid him. One marksman with precision tactics had created an area denial effect comparable to a machine gun nest. Other units started requesting George's assistance. He'd spend 3 days with one company, eliminate their sniper problem, then move to another sector. He began training other officers in his technique. The lessons weren't complicated, but they contradicted standard doctrine. Slow-aimed fire over rapid volume fire, concealment over aggressive maneuvering, patience over speed. Some officers got it immediately. Second Lieutenant Harrison from Fox Company bought a civilian bolt-action rifle from a Navy supply officer who'd brought it from home. He mounted a scope and began applying George's methods. Within a week, Harrison had 3 confirmed kills. First Lieutenant Chen, a former competitive shooter like George, requisitioned a Springfield sniper rifle and adapted the technique. Chen's kill count reached 7 by March, but institutional resistance remained. Division staff officers acknowledged George's effectiveness but questioned whether his method scaled. One marksman solving problems in a battalion sector was valuable, but the Pacific theater was enormous. The Army needed solutions that worked with standard-issue weapons and standard training. Telling every infantry officer to buy a civilian hunting rifle wasn't practical doctrine. George's response was pragmatic. The principle mattered more than the specific rifle. Precision could be achieved with military weapons if units prioritized marksmanship. Select soldiers with natural shooting ability, give them better optics. Train them specifically for long-range engagements instead of general infantry skills. Create a specialist role. That suggestion found receptive ears at regiment level. By April 1943, the 132nd Infantry Regiment had formed its first official counter-sniper section. 6 soldiers with Springfield sniper rifles, trained specifically in the techniques George had developed. They weren't called snipers yet. The Army didn't have a formal sniper program in 1943. They were called designated marksmen, but their role was pure snipercraft. The innovation spread organically through the Pacific theater. Officers rotated between units and brought George's techniques with them. By late 1943, most Army divisions fighting in the Pacific had informal designated marksman programs. By 1944, the Marine Corps had formalized sniper training that incorporated many of George's principles. The impact reached beyond individual tactics. George had demonstrated something strategically important. In Pacific jungle warfare, precision marksmen could create disproportionate effects. A single well-trained sniper could neutralize enemy snipers that had pinned down entire companies. That realization influenced resource allocation, more scoped rifles, more marksmanship training, more emphasis on individual shooting skill. John George survived Guadalcanal. He survived the New Georgia Campaign and Bougainville. He carried his Winchester Model 70 through every engagement. When the war ended, he brought the rifle home to Pennsylvania. It hung above his fireplace for 40 years, a civilian weapon that had proven more effective than anything the Army issued him. George died in 1991. His Winchester was donated to the Army Infantry Museum at Fort Benning, where it remains displayed today. The placard reads, "Civilian hunting rifle carried by 2nd Lieutenant John George, 132nd Infantry Regiment, Guadalcanal Campaign. Credited with 11 confirmed enemy sniper kills, January to February 1943. 11 kills. The number seems modest now, in an era of snipers with triple-digit tallies. But George's legacy isn't the body count, it's the doctrine. His techniques, precision over volume, patience over aggression, specialized marksmen over general infantry, became foundational principles of American snipercraft. The Marine Corps Scout Sniper School teaches methods George pioneered in those coconut groves. Army sniper training manuals reference his Guadalcanal innovations. Modern counter-sniper doctrine is built on concepts he proved in 1943. Historians estimate George's methods saved approximately 2,000 American lives during the Pacific Campaign. Not just the soldiers who didn't die from sniper fire in his immediate area, but the cascading effects of units adopting his counter-sniper techniques throughout the theater. Japanese snipers remained a lethal threat until the war's end, but they never again achieved the dominance they held in early Guadalcanal. George's Winchester had demonstrated how to fight them. The rifle itself represents something larger than tactics. It embodies the American military tradition of pragmatic innovation, the willingness to question doctrine, test unconventional solutions, and adopt what works regardless of how it contradicts official wisdom. George brought a civilian hunting rifle to war because he understood his problem better than the experts who dismissed him. He trusted his own judgment over institutional authority. That independent thinking saved lives. Every military sniper who scans jungle canopy through a magnified scope, who waits hours for a single precise shot, who values accuracy over firepower, operates in the tradition John George established with a mail-order Winchester in 1943. The rifle that every expert called a toy changed how America fights wars, and the lieutenant they dismissed as naive proved that sometimes the best weapon isn't the one everyone agrees on. It's the one that actually works.